Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Museum Education and Engagement Coordinator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll learn more about the German-speaking immigrants to the United States and their participation in a variety of organizations, including ethnic Masonic lodges, with focus on the Fraternal Lodge No. 221 in Davenport. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I have disabled the chat function. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Jess Runlet, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not get to all of the questions by the time we end today. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, David Chariton. David Chariton is a PhD student in the Department of History at Iowa State University. Specializing in 19th century American history, he examines immigration and race ethnicity through the lens of religion and voluntary associations such as Freemasonry. He has recently presented his research at the American Academy of Religion, the Lutheran Historical Conference, and the Society for German American Studies, which has supported his research and with an Albert Bernhard Faust Research Award. Now I'm happy to turn over to Jesse to begin the webinar.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all who are joining us today. Let me see here. There we go. Before I begin, I'd like to call your attention to the State Historical Society of Iowa Dissertation Fellowship, which I received for the 2022-2023 year, and during which period I conducted much of the research I'm about to present. This present project is in some ways a sequel to an article I wrote a few years ago, which is published in the Yearbook for German American Studies about a German Masonic Lodge in Madison, Wisconsin. I visited the German American Heritage Center in Davenport and the Iowa Masonic Library and Museum in Cedar Rapids while working on this project. I'm thankful to the staff at each of these institutions and organizations that I've just mentioned, and I also want to thank Dr. Bill Roba for his insights and inspiration. In 1867, a group of Master Masons in good standing in Davenport Lodge No. 37 petitioned the Grand Lodge of Iowa for permission to form another Masonic Lodge in Davenport, one that would conduct its business in German. The initial denial of their request by Grand Master Campbell K. Peck of Keokuk, Iowa, says as much about demographic trends in Iowa at the time as about American Western expansion. Davenport features prominently in the history of Iowa Freemasonry. For a number of years in the 1870s, for example, it would be the location of annual meetings of the Grand Lodge. Established in the early 18th century in England, Freemasonry is a worldwide fraternity with organizations at national, regional, and local levels. Local chapters are called lodges, and in the United States, state-level governing bodies are called Grand Lodges. The organization is characterized by charity work and the use of stonemason's tools and symbolism for moral improvement. By the 1730s, a decade after the founding of the Grand Lodge of England, Masonic lodges sprang up on the European continent. For example, places like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Paris. Freemasonry in Central Europe, that is Germany, spread from the Protestant north, and it took a while to get to the Catholic south. In the 1730s, Freemasons created lodges in British North America, as well as India and other colonies. Most of these chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. From that time, it grew and blossomed into many other organizations, as can be seen here. Now that looks quite complicated. It's not really relevant for this presentation. European Masons carried their traditions with them to the colonies and later the United States. In some cases, those European traditions were unfamiliar to Masons in the United States already, who had been using the English traditions. And here's a slide of the otherwise complicated world of continental Freemasonry, which is how it developed outside of England with its origins. But that is outside the scope of this presentation. Fundamentally, it's important to know a lodge numbering system the number of a lodge in a given state indicates the order in which it received its dispensation from the Grand Lodge. So for example, Davenport Lodge number 37 was the 37th lodge recognized by the Grand Lodge of Iowa. The chartering process, as I mentioned a little bit, the Grand Lodge of England chartered other lodges, which eventually chartered the Grand Lodge of Iowa. The Grand Masters and other officers have 1-year elected terms. And finally, the idea that each state in the US has its own Grand Lodge. So as American settlers moved westward, they established Masonic lodges on the frontier. Masonry was one of many institutions, including other voluntary associations, as well as churches and other things, which were central to the development and maintenance of Midwestern communities in the 19th century. As was the case with state formation, which required a population minimum, when a territory or state had enough lodges, those lodges could then form a Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge of Iowa was founded in 1844, with 4 lodges that had been chartered by the Grand Lodge of Missouri. During the 1850s, Masonry flourished in Iowa, reflecting the young state's development. In 1851, the Grand Lodge of Iowa granted a dispensation to 12 new lodges, including Davenport Lodge number 37. There we go. Comparing Freemasonry to the Turnverein, the German Gymnastic Society, one 19th century German Mason stated, "What gymnastics is for the body, that is what Freemasonry is for the mind." That the Masons in Davenport were desirous of a German language lodge indicates the strength of the immigrant community there. It is also reflective of the trend of American Grand Lodges chartering lodges to accommodate immigrants into their jurisdictions. German speakers constituted the largest immigrant group to settle in Iowa. The German-speaking community in Davenport was part of a large influx of immigrants from Central Europe to the Midwest during the 19th century. The influence of the growing population of German immigrants in Wisconsin, for example, can be seen in the 1860 vote of Sheboygan Lodge number 11, which had been established in 1846 by Masons from New England, to now conduct its 2 meetings per month in German. This was part of a nationwide trend. Beginning in the 1840s, American Freemasonry spread with Western expansion, and the Grand Lodges recognized the importance of allowing ethnic lodges. San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York hosted Italian, French, and German lodges. In New Orleans, lodges worked in German, Italian, French, and Spanish languages. And in the York, Scottish, and French rites. German language lodges in Wisconsin included one in Milwaukee, as well as 2 others. And a group of German-speaking Masons from Kentucky had formed another. I'll get to that one in a second. As we will see, Grandmaster Peck tabled the initial request for a German language lodge in Davenport. And the next Grandmaster, Reuben Mickle, eventually granted that request. Early residents of Davenport believed that it would become a place of commercial importance because of its position on the Mississippi River. Davenport attracted German-speaking immigrants from its early period. For example, a family from Württemberg settled near the village of Davenport within weeks of its founding in 1836. Many German immigrants had previously spent time in another important river city, Cincinnati, Ohio. Because of its location on the Mississippi River, Davenport developed quickly, becoming, by the 1850s, the boomtown of eastern Iowa. Not only that, but Davenport also became a predominantly German city during the antebellum era. While most German-speaking immigrants in Iowa settled on farms, Davenport and other river cities attracted a number of German-speaking professionals, business owners, and artisans, who provided a boost to the local economy. Many of Davenport's entrepreneurs and professionals had been involved in, and indeed leaders of, the 1848 European revolutions, which after they failed, many of the German-American immigrants after that time had been, came over as a result of those revolutions. Most of the German speakers to settle in Davenport were from the northern German province of Schleswig-Holstein. One historian referred to Davenport as, quote, the most German city in the entire West. politically and socially. An immigrant from Mecklenburg wrote in an 1851 letter that, quote, "One hardly realizes one is in America because one hears German everywhere." During the 1850s, the metropolitan area of Davenport experienced tremendous growth in population, increasing from about 2,500 in 1848 to 18,000 in 1860. Because of this tremendous growth in population and excitement about new transportation connections, in the 1850s, Davenport developed into one of the most important cities in the upper Mississippi. In the 1850s as well, Davenport annexed East Davenport and West Davenport. You can see on the zoomed in map here, this is actually a 1859 map of Iowa and all of the Masonic bodies active at that time. And here you can see a few active in and around Davenport. Iowa Freemasonry expanded most rapidly in the years 1854 and 1857. In 1854 alone, 21 new lodges were established, including Tuscan Lodge No. 57, a second lodge in Davenport. This growth included many more German immigrants. Paul Bergmeister, an immigrant from Schleswig-Holstein, was a foreman on the first bridge across the Mississippi. Antoine Leclerc, one of the founders of Davenport, managed the completion of Iowa's first railroad, the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad between Davenport and Iowa City, between 1853 and 1855. Until this time, ferries and steamboats had provided transportation of people and of goods. But in April 1856, railroad workers extended the first bridge across the Mississippi River from Rock Island, Illinois, to Davenport, thereby directly linking Iowa with eastern markets, for example, Chicago. Thereafter, Davenport was a hub not only of river traffic, but also of railroads. And again, this is one of the main ways that German immigrants and others ended up in Davenport. German immigrants played significant roles in community development in the American Midwest in general, and their relatively high percentage of the population is well known. For immigrants in the United States, Verein, that is the German clubs, social clubs, including ethnic churches, fire companies, shooting and singing societies, and other social and cultural associations, provided a sense of community based on the mutual background and rituals and a similar value system. Immigrants' participation in these groups was not merely a way to deal with their new situations in the United States, as some historians have posited. Rather, it was an integral part of their Americanization, through which immigrants would not only reestablish former ties, but also to maintain patterns of language and custom. Especially in the Midwest, immigrants embraced their German culture, while also participating in American life through their Vereinsleben, that is club life in general, or social club activity. Just as voluntary organizations like the Masonic Lodge or the Turnverein were central to the building of a broader community, they also served as cultural and social centers of the ethnic community itself. Through, for example, their lodge halls and other buildings would be used for other functions outside of the Masonic organization. Through Verein, German immigrants continued the organizational life that had been central to European society in Europe. So whereas some historians and others have thought that these were a way of like coping with the immigrant trauma, the immigration experience, rather it was continuing something that had already been going on in Europe. And it's important to realize that there were Freemasons in Germany as well as the United States. Despite the presence of know-nothings and other nativists in Davenport, German immigrants created and established the familiar singing societies, Turnverein, and other social groups, which would soon characterize German America. For example, led by Christian Miller, a native of Kiel, Germans in Davenport founded the Davenport Turner Society in 1852. The founding members of Davenport's first Turner group believed they should not only promote traditional goals as stated in the group's motto, which was a sound mind in a sound body, but also play an activist role in politics, both in Germany and the United States. German Congregationalists started their church in 1854, and German Catholics began St. Kunigunda Parish in 1856. Around the same time, German-speaking residents built Holyborns Hall and Larman's Hall, and again, these would have been used for social functions of the community, whether it was theater or whatever, for musical and theatrical performances. In 1861, German-speaking Jews in Davenport formed the B'nai Israel congregation. By the time of the death of Davenport founder Antoine Leclerc in 1861, Germans had become well integrated into Davenport society and politics, and their number continued to grow. By 1858, 24% of Davenport residents were German, and by 1860, Germans made up the largest contingent of immigrants in Scott County. Some of their political influence was the part of the 48ers, that is, those political refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848. For example, Theodor Gulick was editor of Der Demokrat, the newspaper, and thereby exercised great influence over the German settlers of eastern Iowa. August F. Mast, founder of the Manor Corps men's choir, and Hans Reimer Clausen spoke publicly in reaction to discussion of prohibition in Davenport. In 1859, Nicholas Rush, an immigrant from Schleswig-Holstein, was elected lieutenant governor of Iowa. I'm skipping over largely the Civil War era in Davenport. It doesn't really figure into the story I'm trying to get to. However, in 1862, the Tuscan Lodge surrendered their charter. The Grand Lodge proceedings for the year do not reveal exactly why, but it would not be surprising if it was because of the war. Many lodges throughout the United States, both in the North and the South, either closed up shop completely or temporarily stopped functioning during the war. So in 1867, Davenport residents numbered nearly 25,000. After the congregation built a new building to accommodate its growth, Reverend A.B. Kendig of the 14th Street Methodist Church, Episcopal Church, invited the Grand Lodge of Iowa to lay its cornerstone. This was a common practice for new public buildings. Churches at the time were considered as such. Kendig was appointed that year to the position of Grand Orator of the Grand Lodge. And it was common, especially for ministers, Protestant ministers, to become involved in Masonic lodges. In June 1867, Grand Master Reuben Mickle laid the cornerstone, and Grand Secretary Theodore S. Parvin gave an address on the relation of Masonry to the Bible. Interestingly enough, Theodore Parvin is one of the founding members of the State Historical Society of Iowa and was an early editor. Earlier that year, that is 1867, at the recommendation of members of Davenport Lodge No. 37, Grandmaster Peck issued a dispensation for a new lodge in Davenport, Trinity Lodge No. 208, on March 26, 1867. In some cases, a lodge that had gone totally defunct, as Tuscan Lodge had done earlier during the Civil War, could have been reformulated, reestablished with the same number. But in many cases, they would totally start over and continue the numbering system such that many that had already gone by the wayside, their numbers would just not be reused. In 1867, Davenport Lodge No. 37 had 139 members. They had added 36 members just during that year. In 1867, about 200 lodges operated within the state of Iowa. The Master of Trinity Lodge, William Kidder, became Grand Treasurer of the Grand Lodge. Apparently, with Grandmaster Peck's acceptance of Trinity Lodge, the members of Davenport Lodge thought it not unreasonable to start a new lodge for their many German-speaking neighbors, In January 1867, Charles S. Streeper of Davenport Lodge No. 37 sent a letter to Grandmaster Peck asking for guidance. And here you see the text in front of you. I've been requested to communicate with you in relation to the forming of a new lodge in this place, Davenport, to work in the German language. Not knowing of any German lodges in the state working in that language, we, therefore, the committee appointed on the application of our German brethren, were at a loss how to proceed. But if you will grant a dispensation for a lodge to work in the German language, we will report, asking Davenport Lodge No. 37 to recommend the German brethren to you for a dispensation. Note some of the language in here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of complicated with dispensations and who gets recommended and all of that. And it is important to know that Streeper was a chairman of a committee as well as a member of Davenport Lodge No. 37, which had on its membership some of the German-speaking residents of Davenport. We'll talk about in a minute. So Streeper was acting as chairman of the Committee on Transcripts of Lodges under dispensation, the committee which usually would make suggestions for the Grand Master. But in this case, the committee members were at a loss how to proceed, since there was no precedent for a lodge in Iowa to work in a non-English language, as the letter says. Peck denied the request for a dispensation because he thought it would unnecessarily isolate the Germans in Davenport, that Grand Lodge officers would, quote, have no oversight over their ritual and work, because not understanding it, and therefore could not control it, end quote. Perhaps Peck had heard of the refusal of the Grand Master of Minnesota to grant a dispensation to a German language lodge in his territory. This had happened earlier that year, and it was regular for Grand Lodge communications to include what they called foreign correspondence, which would be letters from other states, Grand Lodges. Wisconsin also had an incident of a German language lodge being disallowed by the Grand Lodge. This is the one with members originally from Kentucky, which I mentioned earlier. They apparently had applied to the Grand Lodge to have a dispensation, but once he realized, that the Grand Master of Wisconsin, that is, realized they had been Southern sympathizers, he denied their request. Wisconsin's Grand Lodge had previously issued charters to at least 3 German language lodges formed by members of the growing immigrant population within its jurisdiction, as I had mentioned earlier. Perhaps Peck was simply too busy and found it expedient to leave the matter up to his successor. Because of the timing of the Grand Lodge schedule, they generally meet in June and then every year annually. So by the following month or two, he knew there would be a new replacement for him as Grand Master. And like I said, Campbell Peck was otherwise occupied. Campbell Peck was at the time a partner in the dominant Indian trading firm of the Upper Missouri River, and may even have been out of state when he responded to this request by Streeper et al. So Campbell Peck, a native of New York, had been a resident of Keokuk since 1858, where he was a master of Hardin Lodge number 29 in 1866. He entered a business partnership with his brother-in-law, Elias H. Durfee, wherein the two owned 14 steamboats on the Missouri River and operated on government shipping contracts. They began with one boat based in St. Louis, but in anticipation of the railroad extension to Sioux City, they expanded their operation. In the summer of 1867, Durfee and Peck built a new store at Fort Union and entered an agreement with the Northwest Fur Company. By August, they were in Montana Territory with a government license to trade with the Crow and Assiniboine. That fall, their men had built Fort Peck in prime buffalo country. And they worked both with the native tribes as well as the federal government, supplying, transporting buffalo robes and supplying weapons and other supplies to the U.S. Army. Though Peck would generally stay back in Iowa, quote, during each navigation season, he tried to visit the upper Missouri posts at least once and sometimes twice per year. Nevertheless, whether or not he was there, Peck forwarded the request to the Grand Lodge for consideration and such action or recommendation to the incoming Grand Master as he may deem expedient. Peck claimed, again, that the 2 lodges already existing in Davenport were enough, and that the Grand Lodge of Iowa would have no direct oversight or control over the work of a German language lodge because of the language difference. It is interesting to look at this after the fact because, like I said, this is part of a pattern of establishment of more ethnic lodges, not just German, but others. And Peck, being in the throes of it, could not have known that from his perspective necessarily. His opinion reflects that of other Grand Lodge officers in other states as well. For example, Orlando Foster, an officer of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, expressed the difficulty he experienced during an 1856 visit to Aurora Lodge in Milwaukee. And this is him speaking, quote, this lodge is composed wholly of Germans doing their work in the German language, with which I am unacquainted and could not judge as to the letter of their work. I have attempted to give them instruction, but could not judge of their accuracy. 2 months later, in August 1867, Peck's successor, Grandmaster Reuben Mickle, granted a dispensation for the new lodge in Davenport. And at the next session, that is June of 1868, the lodge received its charter as Fraternal Lodge No. 221. Trinity Lodge No. 208 and Fraternal Lodge No. 221, therefore, both received their charters at the 1868 session of the Grand Lodge, held in Des Moines on June 3rd. Grandmaster Reuben Mickle, himself the child of German-speaking immigrants, was not necessarily more open to the idea of a German language lodge. In fact, he later suggested that had he been consulted beforehand, he, quote, might and probably should have discouraged it. In part because, as Peck had suggested, the two lodges in Davenport could have been enough for the Masons there. But he had been a fill-in for Peck, and was more familiar with the situation in Davenport. He had served in the Grand Lodge for a few years prior to this. So it's also interesting to note that for a person to end up becoming elected as Grand Master, they would have elected in all the other officer chairs, more than likely, up until that point. So this could have been a 7-year process for Mickle to have been fully involved with Grand Lodge officer goings-on before he got to the chair as Grand Master. Moreover, as Deputy Grand Master under Peck, he had presided at some meetings of the Grand Lodge in Peck's absence. Perhaps he even saw the letter from Streeper and then forwarded that to Peck via some other means. Mickle was also likely more aware of the broader trend of allowing lodges to meet in languages other than English. As I said, he's a child of German immigrants. Just the previous year, Grandmaster W.S. Whitehead of New Jersey had accepted a German language lodge. So with perhaps a bit of discernment, Mickle suggested and recommended that they, meaning the lodge, be required to keep their records and make their returns in the English language. Perhaps he was following the cue from Wisconsin Grand Lodge officers who, a decade earlier, had made the same decision to require German language lodges to keep records in English as well as German. Wisconsin had also set up a German lecturer to work alongside the Grand Lecturer. This is one of the Grand Lodge officer positions. And this is common in most states, other than this German lecturer thing. The Grand Lecturer was a traditional Grand Lodge officer position with responsibilities that included instructing the lodges in ritual matters. A lot of this was memorization, knowing where to stand during ceremonies, that sort of thing. Wisconsin went a step further by creating a second Grand Lecturer position, one to work specifically with its German language lodges. Now, in my research, I found that Wisconsin is a little bit unique in like the number of German language lodges they had at one point, 4 or 5. Other states may have only had one. So this was more of a reason for Wisconsin to have a German lecturer. And as I said, in American Grand Lodges, the Grand Lecturer was responsible for overseeing ritual matters, discipline, and jurisprudence within subordinate lodges. In 1858, a subcommittee of the Wisconsin Grand Lodge, which included 2 members of German language lodges, recommended adding the position of German lecturer. They saw it to their own benefit. That position would, quote, have the same rights and powers and shall have the same duties to perform as the Grand Lecturer. So even the German language Masons, German-speaking Masons, were on board with that sort of thing. They understood the importance of oversight and correcting things and whatnot. Nevertheless, soon after Mickle approved the dispensation for Fraternal Lodge No. 221, all 3 lodges in Davenport Lodge 37, and the other 2 were thriving. Mickle himself attended the installation of officers of Fraternal Lodge No. 221 in June 1868, and you can see an excerpt from the newspaper clipping here on the screen. Thereafter, Fraternal Lodge met on the first Thursday of the month and had about 50 members. And the lodge, to my knowledge, still exists today. I don't believe they still speak German, but they are in existence today, and they show up in the Grand Lodge Bulletin, as well as websites and that sort of thing. Noting the number of lodges in Iowa, by that time, delegates to the 1868 Grand Lodge meeting discussed the possibility of constructing a permanent building for the use of the Grand Lodge for meetings and for record and library storage. And this was the germ for what has become the Iowa Masonic Library and Museum, one of the largest collections of Masonic material in the world, frankly, certainly in the US. And it was originally, I think, in Iowa City and another place, and now it resides in Cedar Rapids in a great building, and they're open to the public. Historians tend to look at Freemasonry through a socio-political lens, paying particular attention to the development of it during the Enlightenment era, for example, its origins and that sort of thing. Some have analyzed Freemasonry within its broader cultural contexts, such as religion and gender, looking at it as a male institution, looking at the female counterparts of the Eastern Star, for example, or looking at the youth organizations. European scholars have mainly concerned themselves with earlier periods, such as the Enlightenment. Like I said, American historians have largely ignored Freemasonry, except for books that are written specifically about the subject, ignored it altogether. Investigating the activities of German-speaking Masons in America illuminates not only immigration or ethnic history, but can also provide insight into American civil society more broadly. This snapshot of immigrants' experience in Davenport adds depth to our understanding of the immigrant heritage of Iowa. And not only of the immigrant experience, but also the process of assimilation, the use of organizations, for example, in the assimilation process, and the connection between immigrants' new homes and their native country. Some of these German immigrants, for example, would speak English in the street or in their business transactions, but then go to an ethnic, that is German-speaking, lodge or church or other organizations. And this dual nature of American ethnicity is interesting. A couple more things. During the 19th century, there was no Prince Hall affiliated lodge in Davenport, as far as I have discerned. Prince Hall affiliation is the historically separate Black Masonic organization in America, which has roots during the American Revolution. There is now a Prince Hall counterpart. And then Mickle, Grandmaster Reuben Mickle, prior to his time in the Grand Lodge, had been a master of Lafayette Lodge number 52 in Montezuma, Poweshiek County. And that is all I have. I'll leave it for questions. I just want to say one more thing. The idea of, and I hinted at this in my last paragraph there, Masonic historians having kind of neglected Freemasonry as a research topic. I don't mean to suggest that we need to research Freemasonry as such, but we can use it as a window as much as any other organization or business with minutes or records, logbooks, all that sort of thing. Many of these Masonic lodges still have extant records. Many of them will open their doors to researchers or other curious parties. And looking at the connections between, for example, church membership, lodge membership, or lodge members, lodge officers, and business records, and the intertwinings of who knew whom, all that sort of thing, is a ripe area for more research. And my further research in this particular instance, for example, will look at the individual members of Fraternal Lodge number 21. Find out if any of them came direct from Germany, having been a member of a lodge in Germany, and we're looking immediately to start this thing. And it's important to realize that some of them were already in Davenport and were members of the English-speaking Davenport Lodge number 37. A couple of them, I think, from the origin of Davenport Lodge. The idea that they were involved there, but also brought something from overseas is really interesting. And my article that I mentioned at the start about the Wisconsin Lodge was, the significance of that is because they brought a European tradition with them. It was a Masonic baptism, actually. They did this event on a Sunday, invited women and children and other things, which had been a normal event in Germany, but was very much unheard of in the United States. And for that reason, they got their charter pulled, and they were at odds with the English-speaking Masons in Wisconsin. In this case, in Davenport, I don't see anything quote unquote unusual like that, other than Peck saying no and Mickle saying yes the following year. But that in itself is interesting, as I said, because of Peck's time on the frontier. So with that, I'll end and take questions. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Jesse. We have time to answer some questions, and as a reminder, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please note that we may not be able to get to all of the questions. But I wanted to start with a question that came in and really ties nicely with some of the last comments that you made, Jesse. And based on what you've learned in your research, could you talk a little bit more specifically about ways that family researchers may be able to determine if their German ancestors were Masons? Do we just go to that library in Cedar Rapids, or what are good resources for that type of research?
Yeah, well, I'll answer it two different ways. For one, if they were specifically German Masons, that's a separate issue, kind of. But I also happen to be a genealogist, and I've done some of this thing. So I'm actually very excited that you brought that question up. Yes, the Masonic Library and Museum in Cedar Rapids will field questions. And they have a website with contact information on there, a physical address, email address, phone number, and I encourage you to contact them. The other thing is newspapers a lot of times will give not only in obituaries that will list Masonic Lodge membership, not just Masonic Lodges, but the Odd Fellows, the Elks Club and the Moose Lodge, all these things will have been listed in obituaries. And newspapers, especially during the 19th century, have a plethora of information and details about lodge events and co-hosted speakers from out of town, lots of things going on. And many of these will include notices of the election of officers, which would include the names these people are looking for. So, for example, the article that I have clipped here on the screen about the installations of local lodges, not just the Grand Lodge, installation of lodge officers happens on an annual basis. And many of those are advertised, and many of those will invite outsiders. So the wives of Masons or other family members, dignitaries, local mayor of the city, that sort of thing. So there's plenty of information in newspapers. There's plenty of information nowadays on social media. I'm pretty sure Fraternal Lodge has a Facebook page, for example. So there's that. And the other thing is the Grand Lodge proceedings from each state. Many of them are being digitized by the George Washington National Memorial in near Bethesda, maybe DC. Their website has these things scanned, digitized, and OCR'd in PDF format. And those can be looked through to find names of Masons. Yeah, okay. I would welcome a follow-up question on that too.
So that sounds like you have answered the follow-up question, which was, is there a way to see the names of the lodge members? But with that, with your recent comments, I think you have filled that one in for us. Mm-hmm. And we have another question that, could you please say again the website for the records where someone might go if they wanted to find those online?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you mentioned a specific website or multiple resources.
Yeah, it was multiple resources, actually. So if they're in Iowa, the Cedar Rapids is the Iowa Masonic Library and Museum, which is located in Cedar Rapids. They are a good resource. And if you just search in your web browser, it'll pop up. The other one that I mentioned was the George Washington National Masonic Memorial, which is located in or near Washington, D.C. They have a website dedicated to scanning and hosting the proceedings of all of the Grand Lodges in the United States. So, and that's not just Grand Lodges, but other statewide Masonic bodies. So if you, again, put that in the web browser, George Washington National Masonic Memorial, that site and organization do other things, but part of their current mission is to scan and digitize these records.
Okay, thank you. And as a reminder to all of the webinar attendees, there will be links sent in the follow-up email tomorrow. So if you are not able to quickly scroll down many of Jesse's recommendations, most of these will be in the follow-up email. And if you want to watch this webinar again, it will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube. So we will move on with some more questions. And Jesse, I was wondering if you could talk about the types of people that were Masons. Were they mainly white collar workers, blue collar members, farmers? Who were the people making up these lodges?
That is a wonderful question. And frankly, that's the next stage of my research. So it was in Davenport at this time that I was talking about. There are entrepreneurs and other business members, lawyers, judges, clergy, as I mentioned, some aldermen. However, and a lot of the Germans that joined this lodge would have been and were artisans of some sort, independent businessmen. However, there were farmers, and there were, I'm sad I didn't include that full map of Iowa from 1859, but there were lodges not only in urban areas. So there were farmers as well. And the important thing is Freemasonry historically has included all economic strata. And it's, I heard a story one time about a military lodge during World War II, where General MacArthur walked into the lodge room, and theoretically all Freemasons are, they say, meet on the level. But when General MacArthur walked in, some of the guys kind of perked up, right? So there were all walks of life, but in Davenport at this time, these German Masons were business types, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you. And then I also wondered, we've talked a lot about the Masons, but I wondered if you could also discuss the Eastern Star organization in Iowa. And was that, were the women in Eastern Star primarily German speaking? Were they in rural areas or more urban?
Yeah, another great question. So I mentioned early on, and did not get too deep into it, but in the late 1700s, Masonry in Europe kind of split. So the Masonry that I'll say we're familiar with, for lack of a better term, in America is an offshoot of Anglo Freemasonry from England. There's a whole other branch that is so-called Continental Freemasonry that's developed in France and then spread throughout the continent. And that version is kind of the impetus for both what's known as the Scottish Rite in America, as well as the Eastern Star. And I mentioned that German language lodge in Wisconsin that got in trouble for doing the Masonic baptism. That has its origins in the same type of thing as the Eastern Star, which was trying to be more egalitarian, non-gender specific type of thing from France around the turn of the 19th century. However, the Eastern Star, as it appears in America, is a phenomenon of the mid-19th century. And I'm not sure, frankly, when it started in Iowa, but its members could have been either German immigrants or not. And that's the other important point I want to make is, even though there were these ethnic lodges, whether they were German or Italian or whatever, they were still fully integrated into the Grand Lodge system. So they may have had their own meetings, but looking at the newspaper reports, they had co-hosted events with other lodges across town. So they weren't segregated. They were voluntarily operating and speaking in German. I don't know of any Eastern Star organizations that would have been totally language specific other than English.
Okay, thank you. And since you have mentioned German, Jesse, could you talk a little bit about when German-speaking lodges gave up on speaking German in their meetings?
World War I. Generally, yeah. So
Sure.
there is one. I mentioned Aurora Lodge in Wisconsin. That one in Milwaukee still operates totally in German. That's one that I know of in the country. Others, there was a Germania Lodge in New Orleans. There was something in San Francisco. A lot of them either with larger member, like residents of the city they got more and more lodges. So for example, after this time, Davenport gets 1 or 2 more lodges. Or so they either like membership kind of split and fizzled out, or even in the 1860s, Fraternal Lodge in Davenport wasn't all ethnically German members. There were some Yankees or whoever from upstate New York that joined the thing just to support them or just because they had German friends. So even from the get-go, some of these quote unquote German lodges were not totally, wholly, and only German. But so they either get kind of fizzled out over time, or which with many of them, World War I put the kibosh on German language operation. And this again it's a state by state issue. So each Grand Lodge would have either okayed operating in German or eventually said, hey, you can't do that anymore. So.
Sure. And we've talked a lot about ethnicities, but not so much religions so far. And we have a question: were Catholics and Protestants equally welcomed into Masonic lodges? And were there Jewish Masonic lodges in Iowa?
I don't know. Well, no, there was not as far as I know, not a Jews only Masonic lodge. Freemasonry from the get-go, from its start in England in 1717, has always claimed to be open to men of all religious backgrounds, as long as they're monotheistic, quote unquote. So, and I hate to keep harping on my article about Wisconsin, but I know that best. The German Lodge in Madison, Wisconsin, for example, had Catholic members, Protestant Christian members, and Jewish members. And they sat side by side. They were friendly. They also had business dealings outside the lodge. In Davenport, my next phase of this research will be to look at these individuals and find out and again, much of this will be coming from their obituaries, find out their religious affiliation. So I mentioned the Methodist at the cornerstone laying. He was a Mason, but Freemasonry does not have any prohibition against, for example, Catholics or Jewish members, even if, for example, again, the Catholic Church has forbade Freemasons from being Catholic. So that prohibition only goes one direction. But Masonic lodges they've been known for having a multiplicity of religious backgrounds.
Thank you. And then this question came in, and I really like it because I have one side of my family with Masons and one side with Turners. So this question is especially interesting, and I thank the person that asked it. Was there a competition between organizations for members, or were the Freemasons the most prestigious organization?
I actually get that question about prestige a lot. Jessica, is that your family's background or theirs? That is one half Mason.
That's my family's, but
okay.
The question was what made me think of that.
So it's interesting that you phrase it that way because it sounds exclusive. It sounds as if Masons could not be Turners or vice versa. The Turnverein was a German gymnastic organization, but it was more than that. They tried to treat the mind as well as the body and that sort of thing. There were, in my research, I've seen plenty of men who were both Turners and Freemasons. And it's not exclusive. There were many other organizations that these guys could be part of. And I'm saying guys purposefully because these are by and large male organizations. Whether it was the Odd Fellows or this local St. Patrick's Society at the church or whatever else. But as far as prestige, some of that really depends on the local urban makeup. Like it might have been different in Davenport than it was in Fargo, North Dakota. Sure. It all depends. But the idea that Freemasonry was more prestigious than other organizations doesn't really hold up to a lot of scrutiny. But again, it depends on where you're looking. There were certain lodges, for example, New York City, there were elite lodges. And then there were like more working class lodges. So there's that too. It wasn't Freemasonry's fault, but it's the way that these guys lined up in their membership. So.
Sure, that makes sense. And a question that has been hanging out that I think now is the time for it is, Can you talk a little bit about anti-Masonic feelings over the years in Iowa and anti-Masonic sentiments?
Um, no, I can't say much about Iowa, frankly, because I'm not that familiar with it in Iowa. I can talk a bit more broadly, if that's what would you like?
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
okay. So the anti-Masonic movement in the United States was kind of started off with the death of a guy named William Morgan in upstate New York in the 1820s. And there was, I'm using the past tense or passive voice on purpose. There was a claim that he had divulged Masonic secrets and then had been murdered by the Masons and that sort of thing. But they came out of a milieu which was the same context as Joseph Smith and Mormonism and other things going on in upstate New York, the burned over district, and lots of religious fervor. So what started out kind of that way became the anti-Masonic political party. There's lots of things going on, the Know Nothing movement, nativism in general, and a lot of these guys were against Freemasons as much as they were against the Roman Catholic Church, for example, or immigrants. But that anti-Masonic movement, the movement as such in the United States, also has roots in historic anti-Masonry, which again ties back to religion. The Grand Lodge of England, as I previously stated, was founded in 1717. By 1723, they had their first constitution, which said basically all men are created equal and let's meet on the level and allow anybody from any background, religious background. What they meant was Christian religious background at the time. But then by 1730 something, 39 maybe, 38, the Pope, that was the first anti-Masonic bull by a Pope. So since the 1730s, the Catholic Church has been antagonistic toward Freemasonry, and there's been a religious anti-Masonry ever since then. So it's complicated, and especially when the Mormons come around. Joseph Smith was a Freemason, and I know there's history of Mormons in southern Iowa. It's very complicated, and I would love to dig into that, but I have not yet. So.
Well, thank you. And then speaking of digging into things, could you talk about your favorite sources around this topic?
Yes. I love reading the Grand Lodge proceedings that I previously mentioned, mainly because they include letters, verbatim and whole cloth, that they've received from people, whether it be local letters or I mentioned the foreign correspondence. They consider that foreign to their Grand Lodge. So the Grand Lodge of Iowa may have received foreign correspondence from Illinois or Indiana. But when they receive that, you're getting a glimpse of the social goings on in that other state, whether it's problems with nativism or problems with the Civil War starting or whatever the thing might have been. To read the proceedings of one Grand Lodge and hear how they perceive the news around the country is really interesting. And then, of course, the local newspapers are fun. And I've even had a glimpse of local like manuscript records. Lodges always keep minute books, and those minute books include everything from a member having pneumonia to somebody's funeral to, hey, we're going to lay the cornerstone on the Capitol building. So from the mundane to the magnificent. I've even seen Buffalo Bill's signature in a Masonic Lodge book in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So there's, like I say, there's lots of information there that needs to be dug up.
Sure. And how did you become interested in researching this topic? It seems really niche. So how, of all the history to look at, how did you say this is it?
You say that with 4 minutes left. So I, once upon a time, I was a Freemason for a while. I also worked in Masonic libraries and museums, and I worked with archival material hands-on. So working in that kind of context gave me at least the insight that, hey, there's more here. And I've always been interested in history of religion. So these two things kind of converged. And so now I'm looking at them now in an academic sense. So there have been many, many books written about Freemasonry, most of which are written by Masons themselves. and with a very not myopic, but like a very narrow view to just the history of the lodge without the history of the city, for example. So now as an academic, I'm trying to bring that all together, look at the history of a city with the extra insight from a history from a lodge. So.
Sure, that makes sense. And since you said cities, I think we will wrap up with our last question. Could you talk about what other cities in Iowa had really prominent German lodges? And are there any that here in the year 2023 still have these groups operating very prominently? Then this will be our last question.
I hate to have a bummer of a last question, but I don't know of any German language lodges in Iowa that operate currently. And as far as historically, I think Davenport being perhaps the most German city in Iowa might be the winner. I don't know, but frankly, I just don't know of other German language lodges in the state.
Okay, well, we don't want to end on a bummer of a question. So we will have one more last question, Jesse. And I think anybody that's listened this hour probably knows your answer. But we wondered, where is your favorite place to find resources for your research?
My favorite place to find resources is in archives, in person, in the paper. We just happen to be in a good spot now where more things are getting digitized. So yeah, the Iowa Masonic Library Museum is great. And there are resources that have not been touched, as far as I know, that are in the German Heritage Center in Davenport.
Okay. I thought Cedar Rapids might be the answer to that question. So with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Jesse David Chariton. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months and years. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 50 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on January 11th. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.